Hello, Internet. Gino, that Pinguino Rieko here again with another episode of Deep Listens. Today, we're going to be discussing Gris, the awesome indie platformer that recently came out for the Nintendo Switch and PC. It came out just this last December. So this is one of the newest games we've ever played on this show. So I'm going to issue the spoiler warning now. We will discuss spoilers at some point. I'm also going to say a spoiler warning when we get near spoilers during the show. We usually don't do this, but this is probably the closest we've ever discussed a game to its actual release. And this is a game that we think, like, the story is relevant, and it's a game that really should be experienced. Like, discussing it does not do much of what makes this game exceptional justice. So just go ahead. If you haven't played it, I recommend playing it before listening to any of this show. Or at least not, past like the early parts of the game, and then once we give the spoiler warning, you've been warned. So without further ado, my co-hosts are here as well. Here is Pete Red Busby.
Good strong color. I support that. What's going on, everybody? I'll get to my fun fact in a second, but just a question. So is it pronounced Gris?
Yeah.
I just assumed it was gris, the French word for gray.
So I believe it's Gris, the Spanish word for gray, because
Gotcha. Okay.
Nomada Studio is based out of Barcelona. Barcelona.
Okay. All right, just to get our etymology straight. What's going on, everybody? Like Gino said, or maybe Gino didn't say, but this is an excellent, incredible game that I'm excited to talk about. So I have an excellent, incredible fun fact, I think, to go along with it. And it's about the tentacled snake.
What?
Yes, the tentacled snake. It has these like little prongs off its nose. But it does this super cool thing when it's hunting where it sort of bends itself into this J shape, and it'll wiggle its body on one side of a fish. Because when a fish is startled, it does this automatic response called a sea start. And once it starts moving in this sea start, the fish can't stop. So it'll send it in a certain direction. So the snake startles the fish on the opposite side, then attacks where the fish will end up once this sea start moves it, because the fish can't stop the sea start once it starts. So the fish is in it basically attacking where the fish is going to be based on its neurological hardware. Pretty cool, I think.
That's much like Kawhi Leonard when he jumps into the passing lane without even looking, because he knows where the ball will be.
I've always said Kawhi Leonard is the tentacled snake of basketball. We've all heard me say that.
Yes, let's get that trending. And I gotta say, I would really enjoy if we just use all different pronunciations of Gris,
yeah.
and Gris, and just each of us picked one.
Gris. Yeah.
Yeah, we'll see. That would probably drive our listeners insane. That'd be bad, right? We don't want. That's probably bad. That other voice you hear is M. Blue Palladino.
Blue's a good one. I'm down for that. Thanks for letting me pick this game, you guys.
Thanks for picking it.
Yeah, this is a pretty good one. I'm excited to talk about it. I think we can finally put the final nail in the art games art coffin.
Finally.
Finally. We've made our decision.
As the arbiters of art, we're here,
Yeah.
and let's issue our final ruling. I'm glad we've got 3 here. There can't be a tie. It's either art or it's not, and we'll know by the end of the show.
Yep.
But before we get to the end of the show, we have to do the beginning of the show, which means we have to discuss emails, which we received. And this time we have emails. So you can reach out to the show at Deep Listens Pod on Twitter or at That Pinguino. That's probably quicker because I check that more often. deeplistens.libsyn.com. We've got our comments section, and deeplistenspodcast@gmail.com. You could sound just like this. This wasn't so much an email as it was a fortune that I got in one of my fortune cookies. It was odd to me that I would open a fortune cookie and it would be a pretty lengthy email, but it said on the top, "Dear Deep Listens Crew," and I think it's from ZP, guys.
Okay.
I think it's from him. It's, "Dear Deep Listens Crew, after finishing the Bionic Commando podcast, I realized we forgot to complete something important before ending the show. That is to say, Gino forgot to rank Bionic Commando on the ZP Made Me Do It list. For those that are unaware, I have strong-armed Gino into scientifically ranking every game I've made him play. And in one case, a game we refused to record a podcast for, from best to worst. So without further ado, I ask you don his scientist hat and get to business. Here's the current list, in case I had forgotten. I never forget anything. 1, FTL. 2, Hotiful Boyfriend. 3, Pajama Sam 1. 4, Pajama Sam 3. 5, Pajama Sam 2. 6, Mist. 7, Riven. And then there's a harsh drop-off where we enter the shit tier. 8, My Horse Prince. 9, Mobius Final Fantasy. 10, Jade Empire. And 11, Nekopara. So let's go ahead, before we get to the PS on this, which was on the backside. Normally we have a fortune and like a lucky number on that side of the fortune cookie, but there was a PS on this one. I'm going to go ahead and say that Bionic Commando is the midline. It is the midpoint between the shit tier and the top tier. So it is just below Riven, Bionic Commando. It's better than My Horse Prince, but worse than Riven.
That sounds about right.
Much like no one reads Dante's Purgatorio, no one should play Bionic Commando. That's not true. Bionic Commando is fine. But it is definitely the purgatory of this list. And P.S., tell Pete that De'Aaron Fox has a YouTube channel, and it's amazing.
Really?
This is an official account, and it's hilariously uncensored. Hearing him on Shumpert call the wing of the three-point arc as the titty while playing Fox in a game of horse sure is something. Also, De'Aaron Fox is a huge anime nerd. His current YouTube profile image is a hand-drawn picture of himself in Dragon Ball Z Saiyan armor.
I would have liked it a lot better. I'm still intrigued by this, but if it was De'Aaron Fox just doing like ASMR videos or something,
no,
like somehow this is his sideline.
It's him. It's him interacting with his other teammates.
You know, it's still pretty good.
But seeing him play horse, they named it something else. It wasn't actually horse. They named it like stage or something. It was a word that was not horse that had the same number of letters as horse. And it just confused the shit out of me.
Yeah, maybe it's just an NBA thing. But I'm excited. I've heard good things about the new DBZ Brawley movie. I'm excited to hear De'Aaron Fox's reaction to it.
Yeah, I was very confused. I was looking to see a movie this weekend or last weekend, and all of the movie theaters were playing DBZ movies, and I was just like, what are we doing?
Apparently it's good, man.
It's 2019. What's going on?
Everything old is new again.
Wasn't Brawley already in Dragon Ball Z? Is it a new?
Yeah.
Did they find a new Brawley?
They
Brawley
retconned his origin. So like he wasn't originally canon, and now they've like given him a canon intro.
But then what happened? What was his non-canonical background? Was he just in like a video game or something? Or
no, it was another movie, but it was like a sort of standalone deal.
Mm-hmm.
So like his whole thing is like his dad turned him into a living weapon, and he has a whole bunch of sort of like father issues as a result, obviously.
Weird.
Yeah, right. Like who would have thought that would happen in the DBZ universe?
Is he also a Saiyan?
Yes, he is a Saiyan of legend.
Okay. Because I figured with a name like Brawley, that sounds like broccoli, which means he must be a Saiyan.
It is based on broccoli.
Great.
Yeah.
If you're familiar with the term brolic, used in New York slang, that is directly from Brawley, because he's so jacked.
He is very
Fun
jacked.
fact.
We have a lot of fun facts today, and I'm happy about that. So without further ado, let's start discussing Gris, the game that we are going to be discussing for the show. So, M, why don't you intro, what is Gris?
So, Gris, Gry, other GRIS names, pronunciations, is it's a platformer game which is as if a animation student's hand-drawn final project got turned into a 4-ish hour video game.
Yep.
It is by Namada Studios and Devolver Digital, which has made Hotline Miami, Enter the Gungeon, and The Messenger. So it's coming from pretty good background. I think you guys have played... Did you play Hotline Miami?
I have played Hotline Miami. That game is drugs.
Yeah. They're known for very like polished games, very fluid animations, and Gris is no exception to that.
Yeah, they tend. Devolver tends to publish more arcadey and throwback style games generally. So
Yeah.
this was when I saw that this was published by Devolver, I thought that they were branching out a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
But it's definitely in their wheelhouse.
This is pretty different from what they're usually doing, but it has some of the same like principles to it. Those animations that are throughout the game, it's very reactive to the player. There's a lot of juice to it that makes it flow very nicely. The art direction, notably, is by Conrad Roset. He did all of the watercolor effects. His art is very similar to the style of the game, and they translated it very well. Gris itself, you are playing as the titular Gris, a girl who has lost her voice, I believe is the backstory.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's not really conveyed in the game so much, but in order to bring back your voice and also bring back color into the world, you travel through this very, it starts as a very desolate landscape, and then it turns into this colorful, starting with red. As you find red, it changes the environment, and then as you progress, you gain more colors, and the cloak that you're wearing gets more abilities. So the first one you get turns it into a big square, which makes you heavy. It lets you break through rocks. Later on, you get stuff like going through water. You can swim better, as opposed to just sort of float with the regular power.
Double jump.
Yeah, double jump is also a big one. You get like a little floaty animation.
Yeah, and I don't want to give away all of the powers before because we actually are committing to not spoiling everything this time.
Yep.
But, this game, you basically start out in a desolate tower. You get a cutscene early on where you see the main character, there's this darkness that's swallowing her, and you just kind of get dumped into this world. And what did you think of the intro? Because I felt pretty disoriented when I first booted the game up.
Yeah.
You don't see too. I mean, I wouldn't call this a spoiler if it happens in the first 5 minutes. But as you first start walking, you basically can't. And I mean, I know like the sort of trope of stripping a badass character of their powers, right? Like Assassin's Creed does it all the time. It's like pretty standard video game fare, but I don't remember it ever going to the level of like, no, like you can't walk. Like you need to take a couple seconds and gather yourself before you can even get moving across the screen.
Yeah. Yeah, you are on rails for the early part of the game. Like, it doesn't feel like you're on rails, is the thing. It feels like it's this gigantic, expansive world from just the very first moment. And maybe it's just because the camera's pulled in so tight in a lot of sections, but you're first barely able to move. You can only walk in one direction. Then you kind of start falling until you fall off the edge of the world for a bit, and you end up kind of in a temple, and you kind of discover these points of light that are kind of like stars, that when you acquire them, they will follow you around, and then they will kind of slot into locations in the world and create bridges out of constellations. Like, imagine a constellation chart. It just draws in between these two stars, and then you can walk on that line. And the game, very early on when you encounter this initial temple, in there there's slots for, a dozen plus stars, and you clearly don't have enough. And that kind of gives you your initial propulsion. But I think that the thing that jumps out when you first boot this game up is the art style. It hits you immediately.
Absolutely.
What did you think of this game just from first impressions?
I mean, it's gorgeous. I mean, the art style has a lot of sort of storytelling implications we'll get to later as well, but it looks phenomenal, and it's some of the best. Like when they pan out a lot, and they sort of show these vistas. Like as you move, the camera will pull further and further and further, and you see this environment grow as Gris basically is reduced to a speck. And it's some of the best use of scale I've seen, I think, since Shadow of the Colossus. And I think it works even better because, for whatever reason, I think it's smoother in 2D than it is like 3D over the shoulder.
Yeah. Yeah, they do a lot of really good work with camera, like when to zoom in and zoom out. The sense of scale that you get just from moving through the first environments, it really sets the tone for the rest of the game. As far as like, you are a very small component in this crumbling world. It's very well done, very good. It's based on like, I read an interview, the Iwagumi aquascaping layout, which is like it's for fish tanks. It's like using 5 rocks in like a very precise arrangement. This is one of the weirdest things that I learned about. It's like very minimalist. You have only certain types of fish in that environment. And they basically translated it into this first vista, where it's just like one rock that you're standing on, and then there's one that's like tilted to the side. It's made to like kind of guide your eye through the whole landscape.
Oh, wow.
So they
I just
put a
looked
lot
up what
of,
you're talking about, and
yeah, it's really neat. Which I didn't even know there was like an aquascaping tradition. But yeah, they put a lot of like very intricate details in here that you wouldn't necessarily even think about. And it's very well translated, I think.
Yeah, that explains the flying fish that are kind of in the early level. Yeah. What jumped out at me was I don't think I've seen a game use watercolor in the way that this game has. At least I haven't played one. But a lot of the backgrounds have these kind of dabs of watercolor, not just the color, but the actual. You can see kind of the puddles that are left behind. These kind of little puddles of color that overlap with each other to make more intense shapes and more intricate colors. And it's all over the place. Like, you see that in almost all the environments. You can see that in the backgrounds. And they use those layers of almost like water spots to create texture in the background in a way that I've always thought like watercolor would be ripe for being used as a game, as a style in a game. But I've never seen anyone attempt it before. And I've never seen it knock. Like, I hadn't thought of some of the things that they pull off. Like, in the very first level, when you're kind of walking around, before you get any of your powers, you walk into this area that, like you mentioned, it's very barren, but there's this wind that blows through. And there's basically little wind vanes and things that let you know when the wind is coming. And when the wind starts to come, it doesn't look like wind animation. It looks like someone put red dust in just some water and like recorded the current, with this red pigment in it. And so it has this physical look. It looks like fluid motion instead of just some hand-drawn, wind lines or something. And it always sweeps in the same way. It looks like this fluid that's blowing in, and then when it gets into full gust, the background just cuts to harsh red, and it lets you know that the wind is there. Just those little touches of mixed media just does so much to make this world richer and make it look like nothing I've ever played before.
There's also can't really recall quite how far the motif carries throughout the whole game. But early on, you show up at this temple, and the temple for the columns they use caryatids. Do you guys know anything about caryatids?
No. Actually, just
think-
from Magic the Gathering.
Yeah, that's what I was about to say.
It's a good start. So for our listeners, caryatids are just female figures in ancient architecture that were used to support columns. And sort of over time, and even sort of at the beginning, it had this feeling of sort of suffering or like servitude, toil that like these small, delicate seeming female figures have to carry these huge columns. One of the best examples is a sculpture by Rodin called Fallen Caryatid Carrying Her Stone, if you want to see sort of what I'm talking about. But that's the one of the first sort of figures you see is this temple with this huge caryatid. And there's this, again, it sort of fits in with the things about the story we'll talk about, and sort of the melancholia, I think, of the story would be the best way to put it.
Yeah, I think so.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and they definitely use that caryatid over and over again.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that general watercolor aesthetic plays forward. I think also there's this aesthetic of the world being alive, but somehow seeming inorganic in its life early on.
Mm-hmm.
Like you see stones that get up and move. They sprout little legs.
Mm-hmm.
And there's nothing that implies it looks surreal. But eventually you kind of happen across one of these stones that is moving, and you can crack it open, and it turns out that they're like little hermit crabs that live in rocks.
Mm-hmm.
And there's just all these little moments, like the fish almost look like ribbons. Mm-hmm. And the creatures, they look enough like living creatures that you can accept them, but they're different enough to make everything feel foreign.
No, I didn't consider this before now, Gino, but it could be an Orpheus reference. Like the whole idea of Orpheus is he's a magician who is so skilled that when he sang, like the very rocks came to life. And like the music obviously is very important in this game, and singing becomes important as well as you sort of go through. So it could, I'd have to think about it more, but it might be an Orpheus reference.
Might be, and I think that the hermit crabs also make sense with the Uegumi idea as well, because the very first level, it's basically all desert, but there are these fish-looking things floating in the sky, and there's these hermit crab-looking things walking on the ground, but everything still looks off in a way.
Mm-hmm. Right.
What did you think? I think one of the easiest comparisons to make with this game is Journey.
Mm-hmm.
I felt that the very first level, at least, hewed maybe a little close to Journey, because Gris even has a look like the main character in Journey, with the large flowing cloak, and then the very first level is kind of this giant open desert, and at that point you just have a jump, and Journey is also very simplistic, but I felt that it definitely got away from that the further in I got.
Yeah. Once you get to I think even the level after the desert, it's more dealing with like ancient looking structures, and it kind of doesn't invoke Journey so much as like Monument Valley. If you guys have played that,
Yeah, I've seen it.
Yeah, it's that like columns and just strange structures that are crumbling. But I think having a basis in like Journey, Monument Valley, Shadow of the Colossus, even, it's like strong visual notes that we recognize.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it feels like this game also is. They have so many set pieces, and usually when I say a set piece, I mean maybe a gameplay moment that they're building up to. You know, you need this boss fight, or we're going to put you into this level, and then we're going to stream enemies in. But there's a lot of environments that feel like they might have been a poster or might have been a single drawing, just some sort of environment that is large and evocative. And they get you to that location, and that's when they pull the camera out. And every moment they do it, every single time they do it, it's just incredible. The art and the sense of minimalism as well. Usually it's only maybe 3, 4, 5 shapes in these compositions. But because of the color and the lighting and the contrast, they tend to be just breathtaking. Like when the game has its late title card, that was one of the times that it kind of floored me. You're standing on top of this pillar. Gris is just this tiny speck on top of this pillar with a giant sun or orb of light in the background, and then it just puts the title right on top. And just all of the composition of that shot, it floored me. It didn't feel like a game, you know?
Yeah.
For a second. It felt like it could have been a poster easily. It could have been something that's never designed to move.
Oh, yeah, you could have pulled out any number of stills from this game, and they'd look gorgeous.
Did you guys take screenshots as you were playing?
I don't think I know how to take screenshots.
I wanted to, but I decided that early on in this game, I decided that I was going to just try and focus on playing and not even thinking that much, because this game, the platforming isn't especially difficult, and the puzzles as well are fairly simple, but just kind of trying to drink in the aesthetic and the sound design and just trying to... It's so different from the visual languages that I've played in most games that I just felt like maybe I should try and approach it differently.
Yeah, I think the game, I don't mean this to say it's simplistic by any means, because, I mean, the discussion we've had so far just proves the depths to it. But I think in a way the game actively discourages thinking as the primary means to approach it.
Yeah, I actually, it made me think, when I was in college, I actually went to a talk from one of the developers of Journey, talking about flow theory. And they talked about how basically you want to get your player into this sense of flow where they're not necessarily, they are challenged, but they are not thinking constantly. It's just this moment, this state where you're achieving and you're moving and your momentum is staying up, but you're not getting frustrated. And that's where you want your players to be most of the time. And this game, I think, epitomized that theory. They got you to the point where you're achieving, you're moving, everything's visually stimulating. There are enough puzzles to make you pause and think for a second, or think creatively with the tools that they've given you, but never so much that you're frustrated. And when I pulled out like that, I just felt like I could take in a lot more of this game, because there's enough going on just in the visual style and the sound that having it be a little bit more challenging in its platforming, I feel like would distract from its strengths.
Yeah. Like, I got into some situations where I, stalled a little bit just because of the platforming. Not often, but whenever you did, it sort of, took away from the experience. There were just a few places where it was, a little too esoteric, or one jump just wasn't where I was trying to do it. So there were a few times where I ran into that, but it wasn't supremely distracting or anything.
Totally. And there were multiple sections of this game where elements of the background would move in response to you kind of hitting triggers. And it was just an element of polish that I noticed, that often when that happened, whatever dynamic piece of the environment was changing, there are some sections that looked almost like a fan unfolding, and it would kind of unfold under your feet and make a bridge for you. They timed the unfolding animation to basically just complete if you are holding in the direction you're running, if you're holding in the correct direction, it will just complete opening by the time you reach the end.
Right.
So you never had to let off the button. You were never waiting. You were never stopping. Everything was dynamically moving around you in response to you, but in such a way that you never had to necessarily think about your actions. You could just play. And there were a dozen plus moments like that where I just stopped and thought, oh, that was really well done. That was perfectly timed, perfect execution.
Yeah. They really paid attention to, like, triggers and stuff. It shows. It's very tough to, like, get those right all the time, and there were, like, no moments where I was like, oh, that was slightly off. They just nailed it every single time.
Yeah, so quick spoiler warning, so we're going to start discussing the other levels. So we've, up until now, only really been discussing the first level. So if you care to know what the different level types are and what the structure is, we're going to start talking about that. So the first level's red. Second level's green. You're kind of adding those colors back into the world. What did you think when it changed to green?
I mean, you can sort of, I don't want to say like you can see the change coming, but like the sort of, all right, green's coming, the forest level's coming. But it's still nice to see, like, okay, it's almost like paint by numbers. You know what I mean? Like, some of the parts light up, and you're like, oh, yeah, there's a tree. And then you notice, like, oh, that's a waterfall. That's not going to be filled in yet. So with the first color shift, there's a nice, like, ooh, a nice piece of brightness appears, but also that sort of, that waiting, they're like, oh, pretty soon these other things will be filled in, too.
Yeah, and I like that when they do that change, it's additive. So red elements are still there. You still have the soft pinks. You still have all of those. But when those additions happen, it doesn't – I thought that it might be a case where you're jumping between primary colors and the other ones are left out, and it just feels kind of – instead of being additive color, it's just harsh level jumps. But because it's additive, it lends just a sense of progression to the entire experience. Yeah, oh, go ahead.
No, I was just going to sort of piggyback. It turns it into more of like a restoration. Like you're returning things that at one point seem to have been there.
Yes. Yeah. And something that I noticed, you both don't have PS4 controllers, right?
No.
You were not playing this on a PS4?
No. I played on Switch.
Well, yeah, I guess there is no PS4 to play on, because this is only on Switch and PC right now. But when I played this on PC with a PS4 controller, I have my light bar set to be just kind of like a generic blue most of the time. When you boot this game up with a PS4 controller, it actually takes control of your light bar on your controller, and it changes it dynamically with the levels that you're in.
Oh, that's nice.
But it doesn't just do it. I thought it was just going to be, it's light pink early. And I thought, it changes it to light pink because light pink is one of this game's aesthetics. But it actually changes from level to level and from screen to screen. So when you're in red, it's like a light pink. If you go into a section where it's redder than that, it will turn harsh red. Then in green, it turned green. There were sections of green where you were indoors and it was a little bit pinker, and it changed pink. It kept doing that over and over and over again. And that's a touch. This game isn't out on PS4. They built into this game this specific interaction with a controller that is not the normal controller. Most people on PC play with a Xbox controller, I would assume. So it was just a nice little touch that I got to experience that I don't know that everyone will, but I recommend it because it just shows again the level of craft that went into this and forethought. I thought my controller was acting weird. Like I thought something was wrong, but it was actually just intelligent design.
Yeah. That's such a subtle touch that if they do it correctly, it really adds to the experience. I'm glad they got it down to a science with that.
Yeah, I had like jumping from one screen to another, it dynamically changing. I was blown away.
Yeah.
That I haven't played any. Literally, I've never played another PC game that does that. Now, maybe some does, and I just haven't played it. If someone has played one that has actually done that with a PS4 controller, let me know. I would love to check it out. But it's such a little thing to put enough time. It's not a trivial thing to do that and to get the triggers right. But they did. Yeah. So, what did you think of the section with the little robot buddy in green?
I love that little guy.
Oh, the guy with the apples?
Yeah.
He's cute.
I think it was nice to have a little companion for a while.
Yeah, a little levity too. I mean, it's a great game, but it's heavy isn't quite the right word. But it was nice to have like a little chum for a bit.
Yeah, it's sparse for the most part, and lonely.
It's a little austere, maybe.
Yeah, and I think just the animations on the trees in this section blew me away. You have these trees that are kind of moving platforms or disappearing platforms. Think like Mega Man blocks, kind of, but they're square-looking trees, and they move and manipulate. They look fluid. Some of them will start as squares, and then they'll kind of distort and turn into wedges that you can run up. Some of them will distort and then vanish. And every time the world would change in that way, I just thought, using something that is supposed to behave as one type of material and making it behave like another, it always works for me. Yoshi's Woolly World made that work for an entire damn game. Little Big Planet as well. Was there anything else in green? Because I feel like we'll discuss the rest of the levels and abilities, and then we can get to story, and that'll be the hard spoiler.
Yeah, sounds about right.
So you get the double jump in green, and I like the floatiness to the double jump.
Yeah,
it fits in with the idea that sort of it's the clothing that gives you these power ups, more or less.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So after green, you get blue, where the water comes back, and it starts raining when you get to blue, and you kind of delve underwater. And I don't know about you both, but when I first got to that temple and went into the red section, I felt like I was kind of exploring the temple, and I didn't realize that I had walked off the edge of the world and ended up in the level. And for green and blue as well, I felt like I was just exploring the central temple, and then I would end up in these areas that just kept going on forever.
Yeah.
And then it became the level.
Yeah, it brings you back to that temple a few times. But every time it looks different, so it's hard to tell when you actually get to it again until you see there are carvings in the wall.
Yep.
That was really neat in a subtle kind of way. I'm just watching the video of the blue level now, and they have a lot of subtle stuff in this one. There are platforms that you can't see, but because it's raining, there's water on them that you can sort of tell where the platform is. It's just little stuff like that they could have just put a block there. It didn't have to be such a artistic thing, but the fact that they did that, it's everything about this game is so nice. They just polished it so well, and then you end up in the ocean.
Yeah, and it always felt like when I entered these side levels, like I had opened up a closet in my house, and then it turns out it's almost like Pan's Labyrinth in a way.
Yeah.
Like you go into these rooms that are ordinary rooms, and once you stumble through this gateway, you're crawling through a hole in a tree, and all of a sudden you're in this psychedelic dreamscape. And every time I got back to the temple, I felt similarly. Like, I'm just exploring, I'm doing ordinary platforming stuff, and oops, I've stumbled down a hole, and now I'm in the ocean. Mm-hmm. Or I jump off a side, and I expect to hit the ground, and then I'm falling for 10 seconds.
Yeah.
And now I'm in a desert. Mm-hmm. They managed to do it multiple times, and it was always appreciated. So the ocean section, you kind of become a manta ray. You get the power to go underwater. There's an ice section first, too. The ice section is cool, too.
Oh, yeah.
What do you think of the ice mechanic?
Where you sort of crystallize in your spot.
Yeah.
Like, it's just... I mean, we haven't even talked about the sound design yet, but I just like the way the ice mechanic sounds.
Yeah.
Like, it just has this, like, tinkling crystal-ness to it.
Yeah.
That just, it sounds crisp. It sounds icy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the trigger clue is this crystal sound that's just picking up, and then there's a flash.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Speaking of sound design, this game has so many audio cues. A lot of the time, sometimes I would just turn the sound off on games just because after a while it gets kind of grating. But this game, you have to, just have on full blast all the time to fully experience. There was, early on in the desert level, you had, the wind that blew through, and every time the music would, reach a crescendo, and then it would just, that's when you knew the wind would start. And so it was very, motivating for, I gotta get to safety because that wind is gonna start up. And every ability, every interaction has its own sound. There's, bells that you can run past, and they give, the little bell noise. They put so much attention into the audio design. It's just amazing.
Yeah, the music was performed by the Berlinist.
Mm-hmm.
I guess that's the name of the band. But there's a band. And like you both said, the audio design is excellent. It doesn't overstay its welcome. Like, there are points that are quiet when it should be quiet. They do not, I think, hit you that hard with the sound at all times. Sometimes it's just complimentary. It's not always trying to be a movie soundtrack where it's got to be swelling and emotion driving. And after playing Bionic Commando, where every frickin' moment they wanted you to feel like you were in an action movie, just having some moments of quiet was really nice. And this almost made me feel like I was playing Journey again, because Austin Wintory's work in Journey was excellent as well. And that I think got nominated for either an Oscar or a Golden Globe. It got nominated for something that games do not usually get nominated for. So I feel like that Nomada soundtrack is similarly quite good. Though I think that this game, the sound works much better in context.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if I'm necessarily going to listen to this soundtrack just to listen to it, but I think that it always worked in the moment.
Yeah, it's not something you go out of your way to listen to, but when you're playing, it's just what you need, basically.
Yeah, which is the goal.
Yeah.
Most of the time. So Blue, you kind of get underwater sections. There's these moments where you're kind of blocked on one side by these ribbony looking pieces of almost kelp. And then when you come in from the other side, they recede and melt away. And I thought that the look of that with this kelp that looks almost like ribbon, again, the mixing of mediums, I thought was excellent. The section after this, what did you think of Yellow?
Ooh, Yellow was nice. Yellow, you had lights that would illuminate the environment, and in order to progress, you would have to jump through these yellow birds that would give a flash of light, and that was how you revealed platforms to keep going.
Yeah. Fireflies.
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to remember, what was the power in yellow? Was there one?
Yellow was singing.
Yeah.
And
oh, right. Okay.
Towards
Yeah.
the very end.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
yeah, so that yellow was I think the subtlest change.
Yeah.
All the other levels, when you hit them, the dominant color becomes whatever the name of the level is. But in yellow, the dominant color is still blue.
Yeah.
But they add just lights here and there. And I believe red, you kind of fall off the side of the temple. Green, I don't remember how you get to green. I think it's ground level or so. Water, you dive down. Yellow, you ascend. You kind of go up a staircase that goes on forever. And just the look of yellow, it's really lush. It feels almost like a temple, a bunch of extravagant temples. I think this is where they added like peacocks and flamingos.
Yeah.
So I guess if we've discussed about as much of the gameplay as we want. Oh, I guess there's just one more thing I want to say with the gameplay. They managed to make every mechanic that they have in this game not overstay its welcome. They use it an appropriate amount. Like the ice thing we talked about in blue, they do that like twice.
Yeah.
2 or 3 times. They made an entire mechanic, they use it like twice, and then you move on and you never see it again. There's mechanics with that little robot buddy. You perform twice, and then he's gone. The trees that animate that I liked so much, that happens like 4 or 5 times, and then it's gone. And the discipline to put that much time into designing these mechanics, into animating them, into making them work from an aesthetic perspective, and then to say we're going to use it twice for 2 puzzles that will be done in about 2 minutes. It's just a level of discipline that most games don't have, that most makers don't have. And I appreciated it a ton.
Yeah. If you're designing a whole mechanic, your impulse is to just extend it as far as you can. But this game, like, to not do that, it's like a level of craftsmanship that you don't really see that often.
Yeah, you can tell that the developers at Nomada were AAA, very experienced devs, because they have so many mechanics in this game, like the fireflies, you use them like twice. There's so many that were thought up, used, executed perfectly, and left behind. And it just makes this game flow in a way that most games don't, because they usually have to rely on like 3 mechanics or 4. It almost feels like a Mario game in a way. You know, you get some Mario levels, it'll just be like, okay, in this level you've got the doubling cherry. And we used the doubling cherry like 3 times in the whole game, but it was cool, so we did it.
I don't even know what a doubling cherry is.
Oh, there's a Mario ability in one of the new Super... I don't think it's in the new Super Mario Brothers. It was for the Wii U. Mario 3D Land, I think. There's a power-up that's only in like 1 or 2 levels that will cause you to get a clone of yourself that I think moves in the opposite direction as you. And it's used for just a few puzzles. But every time it happens, it was like, oh, that's a really cool, fresh way to come up with a mechanic.
That's interesting.
So I think now let's... Full spoiler time. We're going to be discussing from here on out the game's story ramifications. So if you want to experience that for yourself, go ahead, play the game. I recommend, really do. It's really good. We somehow played a Game of the Year contender, like the second game we played this year.
Yeah.
After very much not playing one with Bionic Commando. Though that is probably a Platypus Award candidate. We'll see. But there's the warning. What did you think of the story? Pete, why don't you go first?
Sure. So here's sort of what I mentioned earlier about sort of the game getting away from maybe thinking as the main, and sort of logical, rational thinking, so to speak, is the main way for attacking it. Because the story's fairly sparse, right? It's definitely there, but it's in the background. And I think the point of that is because this is a game that's less concerned about intellection than it is about affect. right? And I think you can see that coming through the colors, basically. So, like, color theory is the whole idea that when we see certain colors, we experience inherent emotions, right? So, what reason they paint waiting rooms beige. My favorite example is when you look at fast food chains, they pretty much all use red and yellow because it's supposed to stimulate the appetite. But the way for that affect to work is you just need to sort of experience it, right? When you start to sort of think about it too much, you're not going to necessarily have that same visceral reaction. So I think the story's it's minimalist and it's there, and we'll talk about it. But I think it's backgrounded in order to let these colors do the emotive work they're intended to.
Yes, it is definitely a don't think feel sort of game.
Yes. And then think afterwards, like we're doing now.
Yes, and then ruminate.
Yes.
Yeah.
The first, like, obviously the opening cutscene kind of gives you a little bit of a glimpse of the story. That caryatid that the game just keeps showing you over and over again. This kind of naked woman just kind of reaching out. You encounter this form over and over again. And at the end of Red, when you get the ability to ground pound, you end up at the bottom of this very deep hole. And there's a lot of statues of this woman just in various states of upset, like crying, huddled into a corner. And underneath you, you're in kind of this, I believe, this dark section on top where there's all these statues. And then beneath you, there's this kind of line that is the ground. And there's white and dark butterflies, black butterflies that are underneath you. And I got out of there by ground pounding. Was that what you were supposed to do? Or was that, I don't know if it was a timed thing.
No, I mean, I think I did the same thing. So whether it was timed or not, I wouldn't know.
Yeah, I think so.
So you ground pound, and it shatters the ground, and these dark butterflies kind of come up, and they blow you out. And that's kind of the central antagonist, and I think the central conflict of this game. So there's this woman who very clearly something has happened to this woman that is the statue. It's always the same person. She's always in some state of, looks like upset, angry, damaged, hurt. It's hard to tell because it's just it seems like pain to me. Do y'all agree?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a sound assessment.
And then there's these butterflies that at first they're these dark butterflies that kind of they form a wind that will blow you around and manipulate you. They eventually kind of form up into this bird, this lark, that will scream at you, and it becomes this oozing, again, almost liquid creature that takes the form of natural animals, but you can always tell that it's really this dark fluid, and it chases you throughout many of the levels.
Sorry, Gino, I just want to pause here for a second. I wonder what it is about, like, fluidity that seems threatening. Like, it seems like black ooze is just a general sort of, I don't know, like maybe, it goes back to the Blob. I was thinking of Venom, like Venom sort of very black oozy sort of thing. I just wonder what it is about liquidity and specifically like a pitch black liquidity that's threatening inherently.
Yeah, it's like that amorphous, it's hard to nail down, it's very fast, so
yeah.
I don't know, that's some psychological question that
that's like,
I'd be interested to answer.
If there's some sort of like, in the past, manatees would become liquid and chase us in the ice age.
Yeah.
Since the dawn of time, man has feared tar.
Yeah.
Right.
We have feared tar and oil. These are the two things. And so whenever something reminds us of these, we must shudder in fear.
But continue. Story.
No, I think that it's pretty easy. So my at least analysis of these two is that the woman is either you or a friend or someone in relation to Gris. And the black... Something happened to her. She died. She And I guess towards the end of the game, you kind of keep seeing this statue over and over again in different states of destruction, like in disrepair, arms falling off, holes in the statue. And as you keep progressing, this darkness keeps chasing you and driving you forward until you eventually end up in this room where this statue is kind of on top of a bed, like you would expect in like a mausoleum or something, and surrounded by flowers. And did you both play on PC?
Yes.
I was on Switch.
Do you have achievements in Switch?
Yeah.
Okay, so you did get the little prompts.
Mm-hmm.
So when you get to that room, you get a prompt that says acceptance.
Mm-hmm.
And it's important that this moment happens, like you get all the stars to make the final constellation that is in the central temple, and it seems like it's going to take you up and to the right, as all good games should, and you'll get whatever you've been questing towards. And when this moment comes, the darkness shows up again and draws you down and pulls you down into this space where the statue's in disarray, and you come across this kind of crypt, and it kind of makes sense then. Everything pulls together. It seems like your friend or your love, this person that is significant to you, is gone, and this blackness seems to represent depression or represent self-doubt, whatever you want to put onto it. It's this black amorphous blob that's attacking you and coming after you. So depression seems like a fairly good... It can be any number of negative emotions. And this moment is where you kind of understand what's going on and rise above it. Sound about right from at least a large-scale interpretation? How did you both interpret it?
I think this again points to the sort of mentalism I'm discussing, that when we're dealing with affect, you can apply it to any number of things. I generally followed your basic interpretation, although there is a sort of losing your voice dynamic. That sort of Gris sort of seems to have lost her voice at the beginning, and then the last power you ever get is literally singing. So I think there's a general sort of reclaiming your voice dynamic going on here as well. But by no means do I think that's incompatible with the interpretation you've laid out, Gino.
Yeah, and I think even the mechanics kind of lay into this. So the stages of grief, if you look them up, we have first shock. So at the very beginning of the game, you can barely move. Then denial. The earliest ability you get is to turn into stone, basically. You turn into a stone square, and when you do that, you can ground pound. You can also resist the wind and things that blow you around. You become slow but powerful, slow but heavy. Then the next step is anger, and I think that kind of plays out when you're in that room with the butterflies below you. You're ground pounding and slamming on the ground, and that causes this darkness to kind of rise up. Next is bargaining. Bargaining is always weird. I don't have a good moment where the mechanics kind of portray that. Though you do befriend that tiny robot.
It's hard to sort of like metaphorize bargaining too. Like bargaining is something that explicitly has to be carried out in a dialogue. Like you have to speak to bargain. It would have been tough within Gris's world to sort of render bargaining.
Yeah, I mean, bargaining, at least as described, is seeking in vain for a way out. So it could be, you being chased by that darkness over and over again. Then there's depression, and that, I think, could be the end of the, game where you're getting chased by that blackness and it's kind of swallowing you up. Then testing and acceptance. So testing and shock are both... sometimes it's 5 stages, sometimes it's 7. So you could lose testing, and acceptance is literally a achievement that props.
Yeah.
When you get to the last section. So that one at least is obvious. But I think that they mechanically play out these stages as you're playing the game, which I found really interesting. And I like how the mechanics that you get access to, like turning into a cube, then you get the ability to double jump, and you get a little bit of freedom, a little bit more movement. Then you get the ability to move in full 360 and kind of accelerate and test your speeds a little bit more when you're underwater. You gain a new level of freedom that you didn't have on land. And then they give you your voice back. And once you get your voice back, the singing mechanic kind of brings the world to life around you. Like there are sections where flowers are, you see the outlines of flowers, and when you sing around them, then the flowers come into existence and bloom. And it kind of implies that your voice and your ability to speak is creative. Literally, you're creating things in a way that the other abilities allow you to act within the world, but not to create it.
Mm-hmm.
You don't see either. I think Bionic Commando is a worthwhile comparison in this regard. Like, you gain skills in Bionic Commando, but it's just like, oh, now I can, whip my arm around, or, I don't know, drop kick from the sky on the enemies. There's no narrative there. Whereas here you can see how, no, you have to give the player new abilities so the game remains fun. You can do more cooler stuff, but it's serving double duty here, where it's like, okay, what does it mean that you can now do this more stuff? What does it mean that you can create basically life within this world specifically through singing? And that's, it's something special, something that video games get to do.
Yeah. Yeah, and finding different ways for these mechanics to play out. Like, the singing, sometimes it just makes flowers grow. Sometimes it makes the world come to life. Like, there was a section I got stuck on where there was this ball of light that if you sing next to it, it activated the ball, and it caused what looked like a normal piece of architecture to suddenly fall apart, and then a spider rose out of this architecture, and it became this mechanical creature. And that is something that up until that point, your singing ability had not done anything like that. It had always been, oh, here's a cutout, now you're going to fill it in. And the ability to constantly surprise you with what seemed like straightforward abilities, I thought was both cool from a design perspective, but also narratively important. And very few games do both at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
So were there any other thoughts from you both on the story?
No, I mean, like I said, I think the minimalism is the very key to it.
Yeah.
It allows for these multiple interpretations, but these multiple interpretations are really secondary to the emotive content it's supposed to carry.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, agreed. It gives you enough stuff to write your own story on top of it.
Exactly.
Which is what great art should do.
Yeah.
So I guess it's time for us to render our verdict. Are games art?
Yeah.
Well, yeah. I think we have to use the only tool we have to evaluate whether games are art, and that's, did anyone cry?
I got a little misty at the end there.
I didn't cry, but I certainly wouldn't have been adverse to doing so. It would have made sense to me if I did.
Sorry, games aren't art then, if you didn't cry. That's the only way we can determine it.
Sorry, I'm too much of a He-Man. I actually got my tear ducts removed as a tribute to traditional masculinity.
Mm-hmm.
Fair. I cried a little bit. Two little tears that then evaporate.
Reasonable. It's a beautiful and melancholy game.
Yeah.
Yeah, the ending, it's so gorgeous throughout much of this game, and I cannot stress enough, play it. It looks great.
Yeah.
But yes, games are art. Mm-hmm. Em, did you have a soapbox you wanted to stand on for this? Or
I think games are art no matter what form they take, but this is a particularly artful rendition of a game. Like I said at the very beginning, when you're on Twitter and you see like an animation student from SVA or something has their hand-drawn final project, and it's like just this 4-minute clip, but it like moves you. This is that, but you can play it. It's so good. Why haven't you
4
played
hours
this
long.
game yet? Yeah. It's about 4 hours long. It's not a long or difficult game. It's definitely, one that you should experience for yourself just to have that in your wheelhouse.
Yeah, there are some challenge areas also in this game. Like, there's these little circles of light that you can get, and they seem to just be challenges.
Mm-hmm.
They never detracted from me, and I felt perfectly fine leaving them behind. I don't know if they unlock something.
Yeah, I didn't really bother with them.
Yeah,
I hope they don't.
Mm. You
I
get a
kinda
nice
hope they
hat.
Yeah. Now your character wears a fish. Gris wears a fish hat.
Yeah.
Man.
I never felt any need to go out of my way to do any challenges. If I saw one of those, I was fine with getting it, but this isn't a game where you're like, oh, I gotta get 100%.
Well, this is where we miss Billy, because he would have felt that anyway.
Yeah, he would have told us what we unlocked.
Uh-huh.
Well, pour one out.
Billy can play the game and let us know.
I found that the melancholy moments slowed me down from attaining the collectibles. From extracting the game juice.
It takes all kinds.
Yep.
I guess.
So I think that's it, unless either you have anything more to discuss.
No. Would recommend.
Would recommend. Very good. Watercolor. Use it more. I understand why they don't, because it's hard to use correctly.
It's very hard, but when it's done well, it's really effective.
Yeah, man. When you run into those sections that look like the universe, but made out of watercolor, man, so good. So, Pete, it's your turn to pick.
It is my turn to pick. So I'm going to show a little love for it seems like equally interesting and good game from the fine people who brought us Papers, Please. So I'm going to pick Return of the Obra Dinn.
Oh,
yes.
So for our listeners, that's Obra Dinn, OBRA space DINN, Return of the Obra Dinn.
This was what I was gonna.
Yeah.
This was a game I was going to pick.
Nice. Hopefully we get 2 good ones in a row then.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It did very well in Game of the Years.
When I was choosing last week or 2 weeks ago, I was trying to decide between Gris or Obra Dinn.
I like that both of you were going to pick.
Yeah.
You both.
Yeah, we would have just swapped, really, had you picked Obra Dinn.
Yeah. That's funny. Good call. I'm excited.
All right, excellent. So next time we will be playing Return of the Obra Dinn. We'll be playing multiple games that came out relatively recently.
Mm-hmm.
I'll have to crap this up. I'll have to ruin it when I get to pick again. Well, thank you, listeners. Play Gris. How do you? What's the French one? Gris.
Gris. Yeah, you just if it's French, just drop the last letter.
Of course. Well, if you want to play any of these versions of the pronunciation of this game, go ahead, do so. If you want to get in touch with the show, you can do so at Deep Listens Pod or at Deep Listens Podcast. Deep Listens Pod. At Deep Listens Pod, deeplistens.libsyn.com, we've got our comment section, and deeplistenspodcast@gmail.com. If I don't do it in that order, my brain stops working. I don't remember any of these individual locations specifically. I remember the sentence, and that's it.
Mm-hmm.
If I don't start it properly, it doesn't come out. I think that means I'm turning old, but that's fine. Thank you, listeners. Thank you, Pete.
Always a pleasure, especially when we get to play a game of this quality.
Thank you, Em.
Thank you. Always happy to play a game like this. Excited for Obra Dinn.
Yes. Thank you, listeners. Till next time. Peace.